Madam Secretary, Ambassador Pickering, thank you both very much for being here and for your service to our commission and to the country. I have a follow-up question very similar to the two that have just been asked you. There was broad consensus among officials and civilian and military prior to 9/11 that there was little or no congressional support or even public support for a large-scale U.S. military action against al-Qaeda in the Afghan territory. Likewise, there was skepticism that we've been told about frequently within the U.S. government that the military really was reluctant to engage in any military action against bin Laden in Afghan. And in fact, as Senator Kerry just said, but for the retaliatory strike after the East African embassy bombings, there was no follow-up. So we have the State Department communicating threats to the Taliban, saying that, and I guess it was around 1999, that they would be held accountable and that there would be military force, among other things, for any attack by al-Qaeda against the United States. Now, that leads to my question. Did the Taliban have a reason to believe that we would make good on that threat, that it was a valid threat? And likewise, what steps, when you formulate a policy to make that kind of a threat, what steps did you take to ensure that we, in fact, had a credible military force that could enforce that?
Well, first of all, as I said, President Clinton had ordered that lethal force be used. There were armed submarines off in the Arabian Sea and a variety bombers on standby and ready to go, so that the orders were there. The President also asked for a variety of options from the Pentagon. In terms of special forces, a variety of, as far as I know, there was no option off the table, and that there were questions about the Pentagon saying that these were not viable. You will have Secretary Cohen here, and you can ask him these questions, but I do know that from the perspective of one of the members of the Principals Committee, I as Secretary of State, can assure you that the President asked for a variety of military options. And so I again think that you have to, from my perspective, the Pentagon did not come forward with viable options in response to what the President was asking for.
I also think, Mr. Feilding, that the record is pretty clear on the intensive looks that we were giving to the target lists and what could be found and how to find Osama and could we see him. And we found that we may have seen him, but he wasn't there. Or perhaps he was going to be someplace, but it never panned out. But there are very clear indications using Afghan irregulars who were prepared to work with us, using the kinds of strikes that we used against the camps, looking at all of the other alternatives. This was a constant preoccupation that we had many times when I would have phoned the Secretary on the secure phone and say, we think it's about to happen, only to call her back 24 hours later and say, no, it didn't work. The intelligence wasn't secure enough to know that we would be there to hit that particular target. It was Osama bin Laden, obviously. So it was not something that sort of was done once and put aside and never thought about again.
No, I appreciate that, but to get back to the second part of my question, when you formulate a diplomatic policy, if you will, which says we're going to use force against you and we're going to use our military if you don't resolve this in a diplomatic sense, my real question is, what process do you go through before that decision is made to ensure that we really did have a credible military plan and force that could react to that, to make our threat to the Taliban credible?
Well, we did, and Ambassador Pickering participated in many of these meetings. We had interagency meetings to talk about what our various options were, and I think we all felt it was appropriate to let the Taliban know that they would be held responsible if further action were held. And as we made that, the truth is that they didn't do anything in between the time that we made that point to them. And it was a threat that was out there, a Damocles sword. And we did have various options to deal with them, with the cruise missiles off the submarines and other ways of bombing. I personally am not satisfied that we were able to get all the right answers out of the Pentagon. I think that is a question. And one of the issues always in any interagency meeting, whether it was starting when I was ambassador at the United Nations, I would ask for a variety, although at that case not as appropriate as when I was secretary, for a variety of options in terms of what could be done militarily. And I think you will have to ask Secretary Cohen because we all dealt on this issue together. And I think that the thing that is very hard to explain to people now is how much time we spent on all this, and we're constantly debating what we could do given a pre-9/11 atmosphere. It really was very, very different, and most people thought that we had made up the issues of terrorism, as Secretary Lehman pointed out. So I hope very much that in considering all this, you do, I know how hard it is for me, and I'm sure it's hard for you, is to get back into the pre-9/11 mode.